lecture/activity/performance of the Middle Circle 2013-2014. We are opening the section on proof. Omar Leon is in charge of proof. Therefore, he is in charge of today's lecture. And the rest of us will be participating in one way or the other. And of course, you will be participating. That goes without saying. We are recording the event for posterity with not one, but with 2 cameras. Okay?
Don't even know.
And to multitask, have all of you gotten your little green card?
No.
Okay. All right. These are cards with information about Honors College programming. I'm doing my duty. So take one, pass the others down. All right. Ella, come on, sit down. Come on, guys, you're late. Find places to sit, of which there are not many. All right, before we start, I want to introduce you to a special guest who you will be seeing again later on this semester, I believe on October 1st. This is Dr. Marcos Jimenez Belenguer. He's a physicist. He will be doing a lecture on Jorge Luis Borges and physics, and theoretical physics. And why don't you tell us a little bit about yourselves as the guys and get ready for, why don't you introduce yourself a little bit?
So as Juan Carlos said, my name is Marcos Jimenez. I started out here in FIU, just like you guys, and then I went on to different places. I studied theoretical physics, I did my PhD in theoretical physics. And then I went on to studying this fundamental physics, what's called fundamental research, which is scientific research where you don't really know what the purpose exactly is. So you don't know what the applications of this research will be. But you just want to basically get to understand nature in a fundamental way. And so that's, astrophysics would probably classify as that. I went into what's called high energy particle physics. And I studied or worked in particle accelerators. In particular, I was working at CERN, the Large Hadron Collider. I don't know if you guys heard of that. Yes. Okay. So I was there for the past 6 or 7 years. And that's basically it. Now I'm here helping on college with the honors college first year course. And that's pretty much it.
Well, we're very lucky to have Marcos with us here today and at the Honors College. It was quite a catch. I caught him at Pechacucha in Wynwood and snatched him right up. Gentlemen, are we ready?
Yeah, just making sure we don't have any unsurprised projections.
Okay. The other thing I do want to say is, since we are recording this, I would ask that you try to keep your eruptions to yourself. Right, Mr. Krakow? Pan Krakow?
Right.
Thanks. He knows. We're friends. Anyway, so if there is nothing else, do we have time? Do you need more time?
I'm good to start.
All right, good. And Hetty, you're in charge of the lights. Should we need for them to come down?
All right, so this will be the first lecture of the entire class, really. So a couple disclaimers, or really just one disclaimer. Volunteering is mandatory when it comes to these lectures. So if we see that you guys aren't participating, we'll pick you at random and you'll be forced to participate. We think it's pretty fair, considering that we're assuming that you did the readings and are prepared. Now, that being said, before we start off with the actual lecture, I wanted to ask if there's anybody who had any sort of artwork or something that they wanted to show before we started. Yes? No?
I have something.
Sergio, you got something?
Yeah. Just like anything?
Yeah, just anything.
Okay. Want me to like
Yeah,
put it on the board?
Just put them up, face them, whatever you have. All right, perfect. Now, in the meantime, quick question. This is, we won't hold this against you, but we're kind of curious. Who here read Flatland? Okay, perfect. That's most of you.
You want me to put them all up?
Yeah, put them all up.
It's just a series of pictures.
So, you guys all read Flatland. How many of you think you understood Flatland? Okay. What was difficult to understand from it? Of those of you who didn't raise your hands.
picture of shapes actually during this. I don't know why. It was very uncanny for me.
Okay. Anyone else? So, was it the breadth of the culture that was difficult to catch on for you, or just
Mostly
the complexity?
Like there's a lot of things for just one reading of that size.
It was like half the book was about the
half
culture.
the book was about the culture itself, so it was like a lot to picture at the same time going on, and it kind of builds upon itself. So, also a little history.
And like the different shapes meant different things, but those things were so different. It's like which one meant which. Like for a lot of them, I was so rusty on my shapes that when I was reading it, I would ask my friends, I'd be like, "What is this shape, guys?" And they'd be like, "Really? Come on."
Okay. Anything else? Anybody else want to chime in with something?
Also, there was one section that I was talking to them about because I was talking about like when the grandson was talking about something, and it was talking like 32 and 33, but it was actually
3 squared.
3 squared. So I was so confused. I was like, oh my god, I'm so dumb. I'm like, what is this talking about? So, and then finally I got it.
Okay.
Just now.
Yes,
I
last
just
one.
have a general question regarding
Sure.
the concepts in the book. Why on earth would you want to know that there's something beyond your world that is so much bigger and more immense when you can't reach it? Like, honestly, if I had to choose between being the square or anything else, I'd be the guy in Pointland. No, yeah, it's making me desperately happy. Because once you've realized, like what happened with the square, once you realize that, hell, not only are you alone, but you can't fathom how amazing the universe is, and you can't even experience it, and all the people around you aren't going to experience it, your life becomes pointless, and it's just a garbage experience.
It has 4 points, right?
So, hold on. Before we get into the why, hopefully by the end of this particular lecture, you'll understand the why, or at least we'll get into the why. But it seems like Sergio finished putting up his little art piece here. What do you guys see? Okay.
It cracks me with this kaleidoscope thing that we used to have as a kid, where every time you would turn it, it would like the colors would flat and like it would go on like that. What are other versions in the same class windows?
Okay.
You guys speak up though. I can barely hear. Just be loud.
Who else would like to give a description of what's up here?
It's variations on a common theme.
Okay. Can you tell what the common theme is?
Well, I mean, specifically that whole phrase comes from music, where you have one set like little tune, and then you start changing certain aspects of it, but it's still the same basic concept. Same thing happens here. It's a basic concept where they're all mostly circular shapes with lots of colors, and they also have symmetry. If you divide it in 4 parts.
Okay. Back there.
Subjectively speaking, and that's a trick.
Okay.
Objectively speaking, Kevin actually kind of went ahead with also interesting thing. That's one thing I definitely noticed as soon as I saw it. If you split them into 4 parts, they're all symmetric.
Okay. So far we have symmetry. We agree that it's colorful in some way. Laura?
I think I heard somebody say that there's repetitions up there. Yeah, go ahead.
Okay. So we have repetition, color, symmetry.
Isn't that multiple representations of the same image? Just the way you look at it when you're a child, it's just like one crystal ball, and the way the light refracts from the different ways that you position the crystal ball, the image changes, but it basically is the same image in the background.
Okay.
They all have like the center with like all the colors combined, like white.
Mm-hmm.
So, but it's different diameters. So I know trying to paddle is to plan and like make it all the colors together, like piece of paper, like the whole universe around. We can't pass the border. I don't know.
Okay.
I noticed that you have only 3 pictures up there. The first, the 6th, and the 7th are the exact same image. The
Yeah.
2nd and the 4th are the same. The 3rd and the 5th are the
Yeah.
same. So it's a pattern of some form as I see it.
Okay, so we can say then so far with these pictures here that we definitely have color. We seem to have symmetry. It's repetitive, right? Am I missing anything? What's the emotion that they evoke?
I don't know, like it reminds me of like a church or something, or like childhood, so like nostalgic and like peaceful. I don't know.
That's 100% subjective.
Yeah.
That's okay.
I
That's
feel
all
like
right.
it kind of, because she pointed out how like different cylinders have different diameters. It kind of reminds me of the Mandelbrot set. You know what that is?
Yeah.
So like, is it like the same shape but like a different like zooms or whatever?
So I mean, I wouldn't know what this particular piece is because I'm not the creator of it, but
Around.
I'll tell you what I get, what I see. When I take a look at this picture, I see nothing.
Ouch.
Who agrees with me?
I see
It's just a bunch of colors and shapes and stuff. Like it doesn't mean anything.
Okay. So let's do this little poll. Who agrees with me? Who agrees that they see nothing?
Well, what is that? Like nothing isn't like that evokes something emotional for you, and that like you don't have any, like you don't attach any meaning to it.
Okay.
No, but I'm asking.
You're asking me?
Yeah. Like, what do you mean by nothing?
So I'm just going to leave that a little bit open-ended right now, but what I see is nothing. So it could be that I don't get any emotion from it. I mean, truth be told, it doesn't evoke any emotion in me. Okay, anybody else? Of those who disagree with me, why do you disagree with me? Well, let's go right here in the middle and then out there. Yes, you.
I feel like if I was able to get closer and look at more detail, maybe my mind would see something in between all the little lines and all the little curves. Because I'm so far away that I can't really distinguish anything.
Okay.
Although it could technically mean nothing, your mind always tries to assign meaning to a certain shape, whether it's shapeless or not. Just like, let's say the face on Mars, it's really not a face. You just see, it's just some random images, some random mountains and shadows in Mars, but you always assign a face to it just because your mind wants to assign some sort of representation to whatever you're saying.
All right, so now I'm going to prove that there's nothing here. And now there's nothing.
I see it, sir.
I see it.
That's because the screen.
Oh, so you guys still don't agree with me that there's nothing there.
I agree.
I do have to agree as well. I'm scared.
So if we shine,
Yes, Stephen, that's what it says.
so clearly nothing was there. It just couldn't be seen.
Also, they were all the same.
That was funny.
Right. So let's break down exactly what just happened. You guys, all right now, well, this activity was kind of planned. We were yanking a chain from the very beginning, if you couldn't figure that one out. But let's look at some of the important things. First of all, when I said nothing was there, what was your initial reaction?
The absence of things. The absence of anything that had been. It was just like a senseless.
Okay, so there are some people who agreed with me and said, well, yeah, there could be nothing there. He could mean that nothing is that there's no clear defined image there, so clearly there's nothing there. Of those who disagreed with me, of those who said that, no, there's no way there could be nothing there, what did you guys think?
Well, you're big, obviously.
Personally, for me, it's just a conceptual thing, because the word nothing invokes many different things. For me, the word nothing literally means nothing. Not even just that there's nothing there, but that there isn't even the absence of something there. It's absolutely nothing. So it's just the way you use the word that, for me, was not. Isn't that impossible?
Okay.
Well, it's called nothing. Physically, maybe, but not theoretically.
So wait a minute, you said something very important right now. You didn't believe me,
Yeah.
right? So does that mean that you doubted what I said?
No, when you said had merit, there's nothing there. However, you had to prove it first.
Okay.
And that you did.
That was a cheap question though. It was ambiguous. So you asked.
Mm-hmm.
So it's not fair. Like you baited us into thinking one thing because you know what everyone's gonna think. Oh well, nothing means. Especially when it's about an image. When you say, oh well, I get nothing out of this, or I see nothing in it. People assume one thing, but then I asked you what you meant, and like you're like,
Yeah. Well, I left it open-ended on purpose.
yeah.
Who else wants to chime in on what they thought when I said nothing was there? I mean, I heard a couple of key points already. Laura?
It was way too big. Like
Okay.
what he asked, like what is nothing to a certain person? It's very subjective, you know.
Okay.
Not only that, I would argue that even though you had the word nothing in this paint you had it in, there's still something there.
Yeah.
So you're still technically wrong. Sorry.
No, it's the word. It's like, he's correct. It's
The
there,
word,
like, physically.
These two first. Okay.
Oh, okay. So, because like when you look at it, there's a lot of things you can see. I guess,
Mhm.
like you can see the paper, you can see the paint, you can have like an emotional thing. You can see like a shape or something. So when you said nothing, in my head it's like obviously there's something there, but towards like the certain criteria that you're looking for, like emotion or whatever that was, like those criteria, then yeah, there was nothing there.
Okay.
To me, it was, I mean, obviously you had prior knowledge, but I thought when you said nothing, I agreed because I look at the images and, you know, nice colors, nice designs, and generally circular shapes. But to me, it was like nothing of importance. Like, what am I going to take from this? And that was my idea of it being nothing.
Okay. So right now we saw out of this little piece, we saw 3 different big words that I want to highlight. And I'm going to change the words slightly around just to make them a little bit clearer. First thing is we had belief, right? Someone didn't believe me. But as it was clearly pointed out that I was ambiguous. Hope I spelled that right. And lastly, of course, I had to prove it. And I still haven't proven it, because some people consider me wrong. These are important things here. Why do you think we need to prove things based off of this activity alone? Why did I need to prove to you guys that there was nothing there?
Because we're scared that there really is nothing there.
So we can understand the merit of the exercise.
A little bit more than the merit of the exercise.
To like establish like a consensus so that we're all like on the same page.
What do you mean by that?
Because otherwise people just get like different opinions or different feedback from it. So like if you prove it in a certain way, then you kind of point out those facts and then we can see those facts.
Okay, so to establish some form of clarity.
So we could believe you?
Okay, so you can believe me, so you can see what my point is.
Because if you don't, we're going to think you're crazy.
Okay.
To get rid of the skepticism that can be between someone listening and the speaker.
Exactly, to get rid of skepticism. The reason we prove things is because people are going to doubt you. And the only way to get rid of that doubt is to back up your claims with evidence. That's the whole purpose right here of this activity. To show you that if I just said there's nothing there and walked away, I would have accomplished absolutely nothing. Because you guys wouldn't have believed me. However, because I proved it, in this case by shining some light, or proved it in my own way, you guys now have, well, you're less skeptical of the fact that there's nothing there. Because you now know that there's something there. Now that being said, is doubt and skepticism a bad thing?
No, it can't.
Okay, how can it be?
Well, I mean, people could doubt something so much that no matter what you do, they still won't believe it, no matter how much proof you give them. For example, in the reading, that happened.
Okay.
Could hinder you from school.
Too much doubt and skepticism could lead to incessant paranoia.
Yeah.
Okay, so we have too much doubt can lead to paranoia, but what about the right amount of doubt? Is that healthy?
Yeah, sure.
It's the right amount of doubt.
So, I guess the word or not the word, but the phrase to get out of here is, it's all right to doubt. In fact, you probably should doubt. That's one of the only ways, or one of the many ways that we learn, is by doubting things and going in and asking questions and so on and so forth. But once the evidence is shown, try and see if it was proof enough. Now, the second piece with this activity, you'll have a handout in front of you, right? And in that handout, you have a little diagram. Does anybody know what that diagram is? Oh, you need one.
Yeah, Ali needs one too.
Yes.
Like,
Any more?
How many more do we have?
2 more. Okay, Matt. All right, guys.
think the picture is supposed to show how you explain something to someone or trying to point out your opinion to someone. You give your knowledge, you give your claim, and then you have to give you proof of what you're doing, like what I'm doing right now.
Okay, that's actually a pretty good, apt way of describing it. When you go out to set to prove something, there's usually 3 different pieces to it. You all have it right now in your papers. You start with your prior knowledge, and that's pretty much everything either you know or it's a group of people you're talking to know, right? From that prior knowledge, you can make some claim. Typically, we see this more often in science when you go into things like the scientific method and so on and so forth, where you observe something and then you make the hypothesis and so on and so forth. This is just a more general form of that. So you have your prior knowledge, and from that knowledge, you make some claim. And then with that claim, you back up the evidence. So in this case, with this activity, what was the prior knowledge here?
The meaning of nothing.
Okay, so we have the meaning of nothing. What about the colors in the pictures here?
That you already know the message was there.
Okay, well, I already knew the message was there, but you guys didn't know the message was there, right? So what was your prior knowledge in this?
None.
Nothing.
Colors of things. Well, towards
Well-
the objective that you were trying to get. No.
Well, I'm not sure. You guys have some prior knowledge here. You know that, well, they have colors. You know that there's symmetry in here. Well, you know that there's sometimes symmetry in there. You knew that it was repetitive, so you did have some prior knowledge. You knew information about this picture. I had a little bit more prior knowledge because that's what allowed me to make my claim. What was my claim? There was nothing there. Good. And the evidence was clear. I shone some light on it.
Literally.
But now that we have this, now we understand generally how this model works, we're going to move into flatlands. And we're going to apply this model into flatland, and we're going to see if it's still applicable there. So let's start with a very basic question. What was prior knowledge in flatland? Or what could be considered prior knowledge for flatland?
Like geometry, like what a square looks like and what a triangle looks like. And
Okay.
There's 2 dimensions.
Okay, there's 2 dimensions. What else? From the book. Let's bring in our stuff from the book now. Here in the front?
Coming in the perspective, like if you're in their world, all you see are straight lines.
Okay.
Or relatively straight lines.
Okay, so we have that we see relatively straight lines. What else? What else? Back there.
I mean, prior knowledge of all of the shapes he described and make up the citizens, if I can call them that, of flatland.
Okay.
But not only flatland, also pointland, lineland, and, well, shaped land.
Okay. Here and then Patricia.
Quick question. Are you asking what prior knowledge we went into when reading the book, or what prior knowledge did the square have?
What prior knowledge is set up in the book?
There's like different directions, north, south, despite it being 2-dimensional.
Okay.
Different customs and how they treated different sexes.
Okay. Over here.
Well, I was gonna say what she said about the directions, and also that there's a full south.
Okay, so far for prior knowledge, the prior knowledge is set up in the book, right? We have that there are different shapes, obviously. We have relatively straight lines. But the lines aren't always straight, are they?
No.
How do they tell that you have sides in here?
Oh, like
There's 3 different methods.
Yeah.
But there's still different lines here. Brightness. Light. Yeah, there's brightness and because of the fog. Yeah.
Okay, so, well, from here we can say, well, you had the fog, right? So you had your sight. How else could they tell it?
They also have the field.
Okay,
And they have
field.
sounds as well.
Yeah, they have.
And they had
The
sound.
bees crying.
I assume they had smell and taste, but I'm not sure.
How do you know they had smell and taste?
Oh, because they mentioned eating food at some point, right? It doesn't mean you have to taste it.
They haven't tested it.
What?
They hadn't tested.
Okay. Back there?
For prior knowledge, also the social hierarchy.
Okay, so you had some sort of social hierarchy.
Their social hierarchy sounded very much like a caste system.
You learn like the genetics
Yeah.
of heredity, of size, etc.
So you had genetics.
People try to cheat their way up.
So we had pretty much had the first half of the book.
What else?
What else do we have?
The laws of nature?
Yeah.
Oh, yeah.
Laws of nature, that's right.
You also had the
Or I think
history
it was
versus
the law of
education.
nature.
That was
Because
Well, the first three, right? They were like 3 or something.
So we have all this prior knowledge that we come in with, right? What were the claims made, though? What were the claims made in the book?
There's something else out there. Like there's a different dimension.
Okay, so can you give me a specific example of something like that?
When the spirit came in and he was talking to the square, he was like, "There's another dimension. That's where I came from." The square's like, "No, it can't be." So we had 3 different ways to prove that.
Okay, so we had, so let's dive into that to clarify. So we had the sphere or the stranger, which he was first called, comes up to our protagonist and tells our protagonist, "Hey, look, there's another dimension beyond Flatland. There's Spaceland. There's this third dimension here." And that was one claim. There's a third dimension. There's a claim made just prior to that, though.
When he goes into Lineland.
When he goes into Lineland, right. And what was the claim made in Lineland?
He's the one that makes the claim saying that there is another dimension apart from just a singular line dimension.
Okay. So that was the claim, right? You had another dimension. You went from Lineland to Flatland. Now, did the leader of Lineland believe our protagonist? No. And what did our protagonist do to try and convince him?
Disappear from Lineland, move around, touch him from the outside, explain to him all the people around him.
Did it work?
No.
Why do you think he failed?
Because he could never take him out of. He could never take him out of Lineland.
Okay.
He could never show him from his point of view.
So we have this claim, and he provided all this evidence, but he still couldn't cast away the doubt of this leader.
He has nothing previous to compare that to. He has no prior knowledge that can be related to that for him to make a mental connection like, "Oh, I got you." He can't do that. He's incapable because his entire conception of the universe is one line. The idea of multiple lines is like, well, it's like us thinking of a fourth dimension. I can't do it.
Actually, technically, in line world, you never see lines. All you see are dots, because the line that's one like.
This is true. So, to add on to that point, then, how important is prior knowledge to the claim you're going to make and to the evidence you're going to make after that?
Pretty significant.
Okay. So, that's actually something we can write up here. When you're going to go ahead and make your claim and follow up with the evidence, you have to make sure that whoever you're making this claim or evidence to has the prior knowledge necessary to follow you. What happened here in Lineland was that our protagonist knew all this information, had all this detail about Flatland, but couldn't convince the leader of Lineland because the leader simply did not have the prior knowledge. Right? So if there's a lack of prior knowledge, which I'm going to call PK for simplicity, prior knowledge, then proving things, well then proof becomes much more difficult. Now, I didn't write impossible because our friend the sphere here is able to prove to our protagonist that there is a third dimension, yes.
Sorry, when you say lack of previous
Lack of prior knowledge or previous knowledge, right?
What about like when you're born and you don't know anything, so you just don't know?
You have instinct. It's a really good example.
You can learn. Like he's saying that, and then you can't. Well, you can.
By presenting the state
Well,
of mind.
Okay.
He couldn't prove it without giving him the prior knowledge. I disagree with you. The sphere couldn't prove to the square without taking him out of his own dimension to give him the prior knowledge that he needed to understand his argument.
Okay. So now we have 2 points. So your point is a baby has no prior knowledge,
No, I mean,
but can still learn?
You can learn. It's not like you just don't have the knowledge, so you can't learn.
Okay.
Baby lines can learn, but
it's not just babies. I'm just saying, like when you're in the back state, if you don't know anything, then you can learn and you can prove things. It's not like you don't. Do you get what I'm saying?
I get what you're saying. So now here's the question.
Take some things as fact because of Gödel's incompleteness.
So he could have proved it even if he didn't know.
There's some
Isn't that John Locke's
Okay. Hold on. Let's take this one step at a time. The baby can still learn, right? We've seen that the baby comes in kind of like a tabula rasa, but he's still capable of learning. So let's ask the question: how does this baby learn? Is there somebody standing in front of him trying to prove something to this baby?
Yes, but in this case, he could have proved it to him even if he had no knowledge.
Okay, who could have proven it to him?
The second dimension,
The protagonist proving so on and so forth. How do you think he could have proven it?
well, by showing him, I mean,
By showing him.
it's impossible.
But he couldn't show him, right?
He tried, yeah.
He tried, but he couldn't show him. However, we have a good point back there where our sphere, where our protagonist had no knowledge, no prior knowledge of Spaceland. However, what did the sphere do to the protagonist? To show him. He had to pull him out. He had to completely change his perspective in order to do so, right? So if we were to compare, Laura, you had something to say before I kept going?
What I was going to say about the lack of prior knowledge, like the reason why a child can learn or anybody that's inexperienced can learn is because of like gullibility. I mean, that's a mean way of putting it, but it's like it benefits you if you don't know something to like be like, okay, I trust you. You
Okay.
know?
But I meant like the kid is just like an analogy. Like I'm not saying just a kid. I mean, even if I entered a class and I don't know Spanish and someone taught me, like I'm just saying like, there's a point where there is no knowledge and then you do learn and you can prove things to the person. Like,
I see what you're saying. Steve?
I'm saying just on that, like you don't when you go into Spanish class, you have no prior knowledge of Spanish, right?
Yeah.
Therefore, you don't have to prove anything because whatever you take, you know, you take
yeah, it's
it.
the idea. That I'm trying to
Yeah, I feel like for the line thing.
Okay.
I have a bit of a strange view on it, but
Go for it.
the way I see it is that a proof goes on inside a person's head. A proof is not a proof unless it is true inside that person's head. So I could be telling you that the sky is red. That proof to me would be true because that's the way I see the sky.
Okay.
You know, but you believe it otherwise. To you, is the sky is blue. So it's not so much about having prior knowledge; it's also about being tolerant to these new ideas and to this new proof. Does that
Now,
make sense?
retort. There is a difference between convincing someone that the case is that the sky is red and knowing for a fact that the sky is red. There's a difference here. So in one case, this happens in science all the time. In one case, for example, I can get this light bulb and do all sorts of experiments on it, and I can tell you for a fact that this light bulb is split up of 5 different colors, right? There's an actual experiment that we do that shows it. However, to you, the light is still going to be white, right? There's a difference. There's going to be a difference between me writing out all the formulas and doing all the math for you to show you, look, it's really made up of 5 colors, and convincing you that the light is not just white light, it's actually comprised of different colors.
Okay. The reason somebody can learn is because there's certain facts that are inalienable. Well, they don't need any proof. It's true for everything. I know that when I stand here, I know I'm not going to fall through the ground. You tell me to prove it? Well, I've never had an instance where I've fallen through the ground. If you can prove it to me that you have, well, then we'd have something to disagree on. So that's the way a child works. He knows that he's not going to fall through the ground. He knows that if he stands on a table and he walks off of it, he's going to fall. So that's the way you build those common grounds that everybody has. And through that common ground, that prior knowledge, you can form another argument where you can continue on something else.
I kind of disagree because you just proved the thing that you said doesn't need a proof. Like, that you don't fall through the floor. You said you know that to be true because you've experienced from the entirety of your life that it hasn't happened.
Exactly.
Still, that doesn't mean you needed to prove it. You just had to prove it. I just explained what the proof is behind it.
There's certain things that we can both agree on. We're not going to fall through this ground. If you can tell me that you have, then you would have to prove it to me because that's something that I have never experienced. So through my experience, I know for a fact, and I will argue anyway, I will not fall through this ground. And you know the same way.
So to bring it back real quick, guys. So to bring it back real quick, let's make things a little bit simple. Let's compare 2 cases where we know that there's been prior knowledge. We know that there have been claims made. One failed and one didn't fail, right? And let's try and see at least what the reason behind it was. We have one case where our protagonist is in Lineland. He tells the leader of Lineland, listen, there's this other dimension, the second dimension that exists beyond your own. And try as he might, no matter what analogy he comes up with, no matter what way he tries to figure it out, our protagonist is incapable of proving that there's a second dimension, that flatland exists to this person who lives in Lineland. Now, when we have our sphere, the stranger, come into flatland, he is actually able to show, or at least he's able to prove to our protagonist that space-land exists. At first, he tries to change his radius, right, becoming a smaller and a larger circle, and comes up with all sorts of different analogies. He's essentially unable to do so just through language alone to prove that space-land exists. He ultimately has to rip out our protagonist from spaceland, or from flatland altogether into spaceland. And it is here where our protagonist finally realizes, okay, wait a minute. I now have this different perspective. I can see that there are all these different three-dimensional objects around me, and that my flatland is getting smaller and smaller. What were the key differences between both of these particular parts, both of these claims and evidences?
But we have to also assume that the person receiving the knowledge wants to learn or admit, because like, I could be completely wrong, but what about the leader of Nightline? Maybe he believed him, or maybe he didn't want to admit it because maybe he didn't want everyone in his country to leave him and go to the flatland or spaceland. Maybe he wanted people to stay ignorant and not know beyond their goals.
So like,
okay.
Maybe he knew the whole time, but he was acting like that.
Okay, right.
Ultimately, though, the sphere had to pull the square into Sphereland to prove his argument correct, because despite all of the logical arguments, all of the mathematical proof behind it, that the sphere was showing to the square, he would not accept that as a truth. He even went as far as to start believing that the mother scales of enchanters and magicians were true, because he simply could not see it. So until the sphere actually took him out of the flatland and showed him the flatland from the Sphereland, he didn't believe him. Only when he was in Sphereland did he start calling him the great teacher and like portray himself as a disciple in front of him. In Lineland, the square never pulled the king out of the Lineland, so of course the king would never have accepted the square's objects. Similarly, how the square never took the spheres when they were just in flatland. So simple as that.
So what does that say about, if we were to take this general model that we've set up, what does that say about the evidence necessary for proof?
It's the same thing like you were telling us. There was nothing here, but until we actually physically saw that there was nothing written on the pieces of paper, we didn't believe you, because we all had our own objective or our various definitions of what nothing is. We all came up with a different explanation for it, for what you were saying to us. And so until you actually saw it, just like until the square actually physically looked back upon flatland, he didn't believe it.
Okay, so to kind of summarize this a little bit, when it comes to evidence, sight is an important thing. Being able to see it is important, right? When our protagonist, well, obviously with our protagonist, we have actual physical sight. But here in the real world, when we have all these different ideas and concepts flying around, is sight literal? Can you see something without literally seeing it?
Mm-hmm. You mean like direct?
Like direct sight, right?
Well, the way that light bounces, like that's not you like.
Let me clarify a little bit. Let me think of a way to clarify it. So,
if you've never seen anything before, you can't.
For example, subatomic particles. I'll do it like this: subatomic particles. We have not actually seen subatomic particles, but how many people in here disbelieve that subatomic particles exist?
Well, I take it on your good word.
You mean sight as like not the ability to physically see it, but the ability to envision it.
To understand it and envision it. Right.
I mean, it's like when you explain something to somebody and say, "You see what I'm saying?" I take it like that, because they see it, but it's not something to look at, but you see it regardless.
So, when you present your evidence, what's an important thing to do?
Clarify.
Be clear about it, right? Don't use ambiguous terms, but also make sure that the person who you're talking to understands what you're saying, sees what you're saying, right? So, I guess I'll write it up there. I'll write followable. So right, clear, followable evidence. Now to follow this up, can anybody come up with another claim that was made in Flatland? That the fourth dimension exists.
Yeah.
Can you elaborate on how that whole piece came to be?
Well, you're saying that if the third dimension exists above the second and the second exists above the first, shouldn't it logically follow that there should be a fourth dimension that exists above the third?
Okay.
So on and so forth.
And so on and so forth. So this claim now is that from the protagonist, I've seen our first dimension, I live in a second dimension, you've shown me a third dimension, so there must be a fourth dimension and a fifth and a sixth and so on and so forth. He saw it as escalating towards some perfection that existed. Did he actually see this?
No.
How did he convince himself that there had to exist a fourth and a fifth?
Okay, we did this like last year. It's called a priori or something like that, or where you, yeah, where you like you don't know something, but like you can deduce that it is. So
an inference.
It's a logical. No, so it's like you said that like dots have no sides, a line has two sides, a square has four sides. Therefore, something else could have 6 sides, which is like third dimension. Something else could also have 8 sides, like that.
Right. So the cube had 8 sides, and then there must be something that has like more sides than that, and so on and so forth. So typically that's called an induction. It's actually a method of proof that we'll be covering later on. But the idea is just that if this pattern exists, then this pattern must exist for as many times as I want to take it. So here's where the interesting point comes into being. The sphere, the one who showed him that this third dimension even existed, didn't believe him. He said, no, how could there be a fourth dimension? How's that possible? Are you kidding me? So why do you think the sphere wasn't able to see what our protagonist was clearly able to follow without visually seeing?
Right, because like the square, I guess, was able to like envision changing dimensions because he did it.
Yeah,
exactly. So his brain can grasp that concept. The sphere, although it went down, it wasn't able to go up and see something completely new. So it can't envision that. Like its brain won't grasp it.
Okay.
So it can't believe it because it can't think about it. Like, or maybe it can, but it just can't come up with like a thought about it. You get me?
Okay.
I sense like there could have been a little bit of bias because just like the square didn't believe his grandson, who he thought was like Matt, who he thought had less knowledge than him. The sphere believes that he has more knowledge than the square, so it's not gonna take something like that as like true.
Okay. Over here and then over here.
It's much like the way I talk about that is a lot like science. We can say like right now we're at the pinnacle of science and technological advances and stuff, but tomorrow we're going to discover something new. We won't believe that we are now at the top until we discover something new that can expand our horizons. And I think that's the case with the sphere. It hasn't seen a possibility, hasn't even seen a possibility of a fourth dimension.
Okay.
One thing I think is important is that in the book, I think instead of saying induction, they say analogy. And I just realized the similarity between an inductive proof and an analogy is they say basically like, I think what the square is doing, when he says, there must be a fourth dimension, there must be a fifth dimension, he's comparing it to the sides in his place, right? Because the circle with infinite sides is much like his thinking of like an infinite sided dimension or whatever.
Right.
And so induction's a lot like, and they call it analogy in the book. They do.
I don't know if this is relevant, but I just, like when I was reading that, I kind of compared it to what we do when we try to prove that there's God, but then like it's not a concept that you can explain, like as in physically explain or prove. But yeah, like I kind of related this to that.
Yeah, pretty much isn't like the Bible like a lot of analogies and stuff like that.
It's like can you prove something that you can't show people?
Okay. So that's one way to go.
I was going to say what he said about the sides ascending.
Perfect. Back up.
Didn't the square in the end actually make the spirit amenable to the idea? Because the spirit did come back and apologize and said, maybe you're right. And he did. At the very beginning, he was very angry with him and said, no, I disagree with you completely. And he banished him back to the two-dimensional line.
Right.
Flatland. And then he came back and visited him and said, you know what, I apologize. You were actually right. There might have.
I think I may remember something like that.
Wasn't that a dream?
Actually, not entirely sure
Yeah, he did.
that physically happened. I do remember that the sphere told him ultimately, even if it was possible, even if there was a fourth dimension, I can't take you there myself.
Yeah.
And this is after plenty of begging.
Okay, what I'm kind of maybe confused or annoyed about is that are you trying to get the other person to see your perspective or your, like, are you trying, you know, like, is the only way to prove something to a person is by, like, seeing your point of view? I don't know if I'm making any sense right now.
Yeah.
But, like, all of your prior knowledge, you have to, like, just basically, like, look, this is the way I see it. You know, like, just put your beliefs onto that person.
I see what you're saying. Pablo?
Well, it sounds to me like there are two different things you can do. You can either, force them into the other dimension, show them, whatever it is, or you can, experience it after the square has experienced, 1 dimension, 2 dimensions, 3 dimensions. He just assumes there's a fourth and a fifth and a sixth and so on. He didn't have to actually go to the fourth dimension to actually believe that there is such a thing. I think.
Okay. And to clarify it a little bit more. So I feel like your question was a little bit more general. Are you asking in general when you go to prove something, are you forcing someone to your beliefs or are you trying to get them to see your way? The truth of the matter is that it's a very dependent thing. If we're talking purely logical thought process, for example, mathematics, then this style of proof has no, for the most part, has no contest. If you're able to logically follow the steps and you start from a claim and you go all the way down through and you reach the proof of the claim showing that your claim was correct, then there's very little somebody can do to contest you other than find some sort of logical error. However, when you go to slightly more abstract things like in religion or in history or even in science where instead of having 100% we know this for a fact, it gets a little bit more gray. Now it has to do with not only making sure that your prior knowledges to some extent match up, but also that the evidence that you show can be followed by the person. Sadly, some people tend to be more intolerant of the evidence shown, and it'll be much more difficult to prove it to them. However, like we stated earlier, there's a difference between having proven something and having someone believe that you've proven it. So ultimately, yes, we use proof to try and dissolve doubt, but if the person wants to doubt you, they're going to doubt you hell or high water type deal. Where were we going from here? Yes. So when we talk about sight, when we talk about seeing things in proof, that's really just having a follow-in with your evidence base. Now, there is a fourth claim that occurs. Can anybody think of it? It occurs closer to the end of the book.
When he announces to the council, senate, whatever, that the third dimension actually does exist after the decree that anyone talking about that is going to be locked up.
Right. So his last proof is, hey guys, guess what? Spaceland exists. There is a third dimension, and he's presenting this entire defense, which is pretty much, at least the way I see it, the majority of the book, if not the entire book, to the president of Flatland. It was hinted at the beginning that many people who believe there are other dimensions need to present their case, and if they're able to convince the council, then great, you have this new wealth of information. If not, they get sent to some insane asylum or something along those lines because they've clearly gone mad.
Well, that was everyone.
Right, well that was everyone. Everyone who tried to present their case, this happened to them. And our protagonist, the Square, tried to present his case as well. And he failed. He wasn't able to do it. He was actually sent to the insane asylum. And I think we can guess by now, why did our protagonist fail to prove to the council that Spaceland existed?
Because he couldn't pull them out. He couldn't do what the spell did to him.
Right, because you weren't able to change the perspective. So I guess now the question I want to ask is, using your own experiences, using Flatland, using whatever you'd like, how exactly can you provide evidence to prove your case? What sort of ways do you think you should provide evidence to prove whatever claim you supposedly make?
I think first you have to understand what the person know, or like know what they know,
Mhm.
and see if with the tools they have, you can get to that conclusion. Because if you can't get to that conclusion with the tools they have, then it's probably gonna be it's gonna be impossible, right?
Okay. Who else?
Present your case in a logical manner where each step follows the next one, and if they disagree with you on any point of the step, that's
see that. Once they see that and they see that what you're saying actually makes sense and is clear and logical, then they'll most likely, that should be sufficient proof.
Okay.
I think the best way, honestly, is to get to that conclusion without you helping them, like based on their current knowledge. Like you said, ask them questions and see if they could like come up with the next logical step, or if they sort of did this here was sort of doing with the square, like working on this, like this line, they talk about this and get going.
It depends. What is your definition of proof? What do you mean by that? Like,
So, when you have a proof, pretty much what a proof is you have a claim, and using either using some evidence, okay, you're able to show that your claim is factual or truthful to some extent. So a proof is the method by which you show people that what you're saying is true.
Okay.
Does that make sense?
But under those lines, I don't think I'll be able to prove. I don't think it is possible to prove to somebody of a lower dimension that a third dimension exists.
Why not?
Because there wouldn't. Because your argument, you wouldn't be able to make a sufficient argument for them to prove it. Maybe make them amenable to the fact, but not to sufficiently prove that it does exist. Because he wouldn't be able to have any sense that it does exist. You get me? Without it beyond, the shadow of a doubt that it does exist.
Sergio?
Actually, if you go on YouTube, there's this, I think he's a professor somewhere, and he actually has a proof that takes you through not only to the fourth dimension, but all the way to the 10th dimension.
I saw it. He was telling, he was saying it's like a roadmap. He's saying like, that one, and then if you, basically the second dimension is just a roadmap to make it easier and be able to go around to the next one and to the next one. He goes on to
So he provides like a logical progression. So he does provide a method to get you,
but not to actually prove it.
So maybe he didn't prove it to you, but he proved it to you.
Can you share that link? That video?
Can I think at least the way we're using proof for this half of the semester is it's more about a reaction to doubt. And you talked about beyond a reasonable doubt. I think proof is like this ongoing. It's never concretely defined unless you're in a certain discourse like mathematics or like science has a specific definition for what is proof. But in general, proof is just a reaction to doubt, and I think that's sort of the point.
A lot of times, even if your argument is valid, sometimes what the proof proves and the claim you're trying to prove is so beyond what your proof is that you can't grasp it. I'll give you an example. In mathematics, like there's this thing called basically we're proving how if you get the natural set and you take this amount out of the natural infinite set, well the numbers you take out is the same as the infinite set. Like it's the same infinity. And the proof was like I used projections and everything and it makes sense, but the connection it wasn't clear for a lot of us. And it was just because we didn't have a lot of prior knowledge in mathematics, so we're still learning about it. But it was like a huge leap. But that proof was like that proof. Like the proof.
I think that's probably the real set, right? Where you've got like an infinite number of numbers between any two numbers.
Are you talking about the timer set?
You said natural, but
Yeah, there's a lot of them.
Okay.
Yeah, we get a lot.
So
She's talking about Kepler's diagonal theorem for like
Yeah.
okay, so it is the real numbers, right?
Yeah.
Okay.
We're all talking at the same time. It's sort of hard to find out what people are saying.
Another thing, when you try to prove something, you have to try to see what the criteria for proof is, because there is beyond the shadow of a doubt, which means that they cannot doubt you. Beyond reasonable doubt, which means any reasonable person will no longer doubt you. There is different criteria by what you're trying to prove. That's a different one of the things. Because beyond the shadow of a doubt, it's very hard to prove anything beyond the shadow of a doubt. You can only prove math that way, but for a criminal case, beyond reasonable doubt is more than enough.
So you can't prove unknown.
Just to come kind of from another direction, I can understand why there are certain reasons you would want to prove something to someone. Like, let's say, like a hurricane is coming, and you tell a dude, like, you should probably leave your house, and he doesn't want to do it, and you can prove to him, like, look, these are some wave charts. This is some stuff. That's the hurricane. You can die. And that I can understand because that would be beneficial to them. But why would you want to prove to someone like your life sucks? Why would you want to tell them like the two dimensions that you think exist are infinitesimally nothing compared? Why? What is gained from giving this gospel to these people? Like legitimately, because they have no natural way to ascend to the third dimension.
But that's purely
Yep.
subjective.
That's like
Wait,
asking
hold
you
on, hold
why
on,
you're
hold
in
on,
this
hold on.
class. What does he have to gain from teaching you right now?
Yeah.
That's the exact same thing you're saying.
No, I think he's criticizing the sphere in the book.
Yeah, that's what he's
Right,
doing.
but in this case,
Yeah,
he can
but
be
not
the
all
sphere, and he's the square. He doesn't.
Wait, hold on.
You guys are saying some really interesting things and nobody can hear any of it.
Well, first of all, I want to object to that because what the sphere proves to the square, and then in turn the square proves to the sphere, is that you can always increase in dimensions. So it's not to say that there's an infinite number of dimensions, in which case it wouldn't really be demeaning somebody too much if you showed them that your dimension was I guess not superior, but like you had an extra dimension, because relative to that infinity of dimensions, you're just like him. Like there's no center, there's no like beginning or ending. Although zero would be the ending, but I don't know. It's really.
Also, in the beginning of the book, a lot of the just natural phenomena that they couldn't explain, that they couldn't explain, would be explained if the third dimension was taken in. So the fact that he managed to show him that, it was more to say, look, it is possible. If you take this into consideration and you're able to convince your people, you're also able to explain a lot of your natural phenomena, like why there's light, which is important. So in that way, showing even one person, so long as they're capable of making the argument, which he wasn't. I'm sorry, the entire book, I was like, you're an idiot, you can't do anything about it, and I swear to God, your whole approach to it, you're a preacher, you're walking around going, believe me, otherwise you're wrong, and that's not how you make arguments. You're skipping the entire, hey, let's try to reason this out part. So in that sense, everyone else had the right to be skeptical because he just said, believe me or you're wrong, basically. So, but once you incorporate that, yeah, you're able to figure out where light and, I guess subsequently shade comes from, why you only have north, south, why the rain only comes from the north, etc., etc. Much like once we start incorporating the fourth dimension, fifth and sixth and whatnot, physicists can finally expand upon certain things instead of just being stuck to this point or particle theory, which hasn't gotten us anywhere since 1990. So, can you come on
No, I have here.
In kind of like the same point, going on a different point, the sphere had an easier time trying to convince the square, partly also because he came to him in the form of a circle, and then the circles are the most revered form in Flatland. So he had that added ability that he was a perfect circle, which was what they completely admired the most. But when the square tried to convince the High Council didn't pay much attention to because he was a square. Who were they to pay attention to the square when they were the circle?
That's the problem, because he starts questioning whether he was an actual circle or not. He starts questioning whether he was an actual imposter. So that point is kind of moot.
The point that he was making, that being exposed to a third dimension makes everything, like, your perspective that by being shown that there's another dimension it's completely negative is very subjective, because you could say the same thing about like space. Like, we know so much about space and how vast space is and how insignificant we are, but that doesn't mean that our lives become pointless. And the people in Flatland, they're two-dimensional and they'll always be two-dimensional. So even though there is a third dimension, it doesn't mean anything to them. Their life still goes on regardless. So it doesn't have to mean that their lives are pointless.
Yeah, because they're forced to adhere to those two-dimensional laws. They can't do anything about it.
Yeah. So
But it can be. It's like in the Matrix, the people that weren't exposed to like the outside world, they were hopeless to like see anything else.
I think the sphere mentioned something about warning him, because like if someone from their third dimension was bad or something, and he came to them or something, he said something like that at some point. I can find it, but not let you know.
Find
because,
this
because
actually.
it was like the was warning him. Pickpocketers or something.
Oh, how he thought that they were a god?
Yeah. Like if
be
someone
like that was a
from the
god.
if they came from the third dimension to the second, then they wouldn't know anything. I'll find it.
Okay. Back there.
the reason everybody was so in Flatland was so adamant to not accept this, even including the circles. In fact, the main circle probably didn't know it did exist, but the reason they didn't want to is because it undermined their entire hierarchy system, meaning that an acute angle is less intelligent than a square, and less intelligent than a circle. And by proving that there's this third dimension, the existence of a sphere and a cube, shows that the circles don't have any more knowledge than anybody else. In fact, they're almost at the same level as everybody else inside Flatland. So the entire hierarchy, the entire system would fall apart. And that I found that interesting because that's the main reason why many people are so adamant to not accept a proof, even though there is sufficient proof. For example, saying that the Earth was not the center of the universe, everybody, even though there was sufficient proof, nobody wanted to let that out because that undermined religions, that undermined the existence of God, that undermined everything. So that's why everybody in Flatland didn't want to believe in this existence, including the square himself, because it undermined their culture.
It's comparable to like when he explained the thing about the color, that eventually it made people see like, oh wait, well, maybe women in circles are equivalent, and maybe we can all be equivalent in our knowledge. It completely undermines the whole, like everything. So it's a great contrast, because something similar to what happened. They implemented a brand new like segment, whatever, to society, and it destroyed the original society that was set up so neatly, so perfectly. They called it the laws of nature to have it set up this way. And their entire structure gets destroyed by adding that new factor in. So when you add in the thought that there's a third dimension and that this is just flatland, like you said, it's going to make everyone be like, oh, maybe I'm just part of some sort of super three-dimensional any sort of thing that can come together that will eventually, possibly over hundreds of years, but still culminate in a collapse of society. And that's the reason, like you said, why it's just like, we don't want this to be a thing. It's kind of
so you think the prior experience of the color, like, made them be like...
It's just comparable. It's just comparable.
Yeah.
So we got back there?
Everyone remember how the social revolution has kind of been the same issue. Like, yeah, we don't like the way things are, or some people do, and that's just the biggest, that was always going to be global slavery that we decided it was immoral at that time, was an American decision. But we like to believe we're advancing as a society, and everything that has been done was getting against what most of the people wanted. That's why it existed previously. So we can't say there's any advancement if we keep on saying that every new revolution is bad.
So I want to make one distinction right now, because I see that with the discussion, there's a bit of a kind of muddle. Oh yeah, it's muddled. There's a difference between convincing someone that things are a certain way and proving to them that things are a certain way. Your language itself even said it. If you can prove to the circles that there exists a third dimension, but they don't want to accept it for X or Y reason, you've still proven to them that it exists. Now, whether or not they use this new knowledge, whether or not they divulge this new knowledge, is a completely different argument altogether. That's the difference. The square could have very much successfully proven to the president of Flatland that, yes, there did in fact exist this third dimension. But in doing so, maybe everything that you just said was correct. We don't know. It wasn't written in the book. But in doing so and accepting this and saying, yes, you know what, in fact, you're right, may not have been in their favor. So they said no. Does that mean that the square failed to prove it? Not necessarily. The square only failed to either convince them or to have them accept it as a general truth. And that's the difference.
I found it if you want to see.
Okay. Oh, go right ahead. Read.
Right now. Can I read it?
Yeah, read the section you want to use.
But if a pickpocket or a cutthroat of our country can see everything that is in your country, surely there is no reason why the pickpocket or cutthroat should be accepted by you as a god. There's something on me, whatever that was. As you call it, it is not a common word in space-time. Does it make you more just, more merciful than men? Like, it was this part that I thought.
You're still doubting the sphere, right?
So you know that the sphere was like a trickster from the
It was when he was like, oh my god,
So
if you
it's
could see this, then you're a god.
Yeah, so
And he was like, oh, well, that means all the pickpockets and
So maybe
criminals
that's
in
why
my
it's
world
not-
are gods, right?
Yeah.
So
Right.
maybe that's why they're trying to show him that there's
No,
a
it's
difference.
just he's allowed to do it once every 1,000 years.
And it's so like commonplace in the third dimension.
Yeah.
Oh, this is what he's trying to prove to the sphere that doesn't work.
This is after he saw it. This is after he saw of
Yeah,
freaking
no.
Wait, hold on. We have somebody speaking back here.
The sphere came twice already, though, because this was the third millennium. We
Mhm.
had the meeting of the circles. The sphere already, the sphere came in 0 and the 100,000. So they already knew the sphere was coming. And so we don't really get to divulge much, but the sphere said he has to wait like a millennium of years, like a thousand years to get back into flatland. So I think the reason why you're talking about that one passage that was just about him saying even about cutthroats and whatnot, about the other solids, is just essentially that was the point I think where Square was just comparing him to a god because he thought that he was so ideal, and he was like, you cannot compare me to this because even the lowest of the low in our sphere land can see the people of flatland. So how can you call me something that is like a deity and holy when there's even worse people in my society who can see this? So that's, I think, what he was trying to say.
Since you're making the distinction between convincing and proof, the Square never really proved anything if that's the case. Because, just like she said, the sphere has already gone into flatland twice. The high circle already made the point that I got this information. I already know that this was going to happen. Don't even worry about it. But all of you guys are going to get killed. Basically what he said.
Yeah.
After that, basically, if that's the case, then he didn't prove anything. Because for a couple of reasons. One, everyone around him they did not even accept the information. They didn't even remotely consider it. That's one. Two, the only person that would have had even the remotest, that's even a word, but even the slightest idea of what he was talking about and capable of planting that seed of belief was already knew it. Already knew that somebody was going to pop in and be like, yo guys, third dimension, totally in, and then leave. He already knew this. So he never proved anything. The whole purpose of the Square was to convince people. If that's the case, then Flatland, the entire book was for convincing, not proving. Therefore, that book is technically not applicable to this conversation. If you want to go that route.
So
no, I think the problem is the Square couldn't take anybody from Flatland out of it, like the cube could. The sphere could, right? And
which
so
would require convincing.
And so the king or whatever, he would never accept it until he saw it, basically. Until he was
Actually, the high circle already quote unquote knew.
They had some evidence of it, but they'd never seen the other dimension. And also I think they had a lot invested in keeping the social hierarchy.
I'm not arguing that point. I'm not arguing that point. I'm just saying, for him to prove it, he would have to take them out of the dimension. If that was the case, because we've already gone through all the other possibilities, it's not possible to, I guess, not possible to argue for other dimensions unless you show it. But if that was the case, then Flatland was a book based on convincing people instead of actually proving it, because he couldn't prove it. That was the whole limitation.
No, because logically, he did try to prove it to the circles. He couldn't convince them. So it's like what you're saying, exactly. Because he couldn't show it to them, and they couldn't envision it. They couldn't believe him. But if you only look at it in pure terms of did he logically have that proof that it succeeded and it makes sense, and did he use clear and followable evidence? He did, but they just wouldn't believe him because they couldn't be convinced.
over here.
Yeah, he proved it, but not successfully. But also, that one person that he probably could have convinced was his grandson, because when they were doing math, the grandson was like, "Oh, but what about 3 cubed?" And so maybe
he tried.
He was more open to the idea of that, because he wasn't indoctrinated already.
Over here? Yeah, it's on their side.
It's getting close.
Ah, we're getting close to it? Okay. So, pretty much the takeaway points from this. I'll make it pretty nice and succinct. First things first, go right ahead and doubt. Ask us questions. Ask anybody questions, okay? If you don't ask questions, you probably won't find things out for yourselves. And chances are you probably won't learn as much as you can. So question and doubt us. We already saw that you started doing a test today, which is great. We enjoy it. I'm sure Pablo will agree with me, and so will Sergio, Daniela, and Jose. That being said, if you are doubted, know how to, well, if you're doubted, we're going to show you how to argue your points. And this structure that you have right here in your handouts is the beginning to it. So what we believe the general method or the general outlay of a proof should be, starting from the prior knowledge all the way down to the evidence. Now, hopefully what you took away from today, with regards to actually proving things and using flatlines as a bit of a guide, is how you can fail at proving things, how you can succeed at proving things, and what is necessary for a proper proof. Thank you very much.
I have one question. Have you finished?
That's it.
Okay, I'm curious, what are the three groups doing the rest of the week? What are the topics that you're going to touch in case somebody, say, from Pablo's group wants to go to Sergio's group? I'm just curious, or do you know?
Yeah, so my group is going to be spending the first half of the class playing the Mafia game. You guys will find out what the Mafia game is. And we're going to then follow that up by creating what we call the axioms of the small group. In other words, it's a set of rules that you guys are going to be discussing, that you guys will be following when discussing for the rest of the year.
That's in your group?
That's in my group.
How about you, Sergio? What are you doing?
I don't remember, but I promise it'll be interesting.
Okay, good. I truly believe that. Pablo, do you remember what you're doing?
Yeah, mine's, we're going to discuss, we're going to review the axioms we started last time. We're going to discuss this. We're just going to carry this discussion over because I feel like you guys have a lot to say. And that's pretty much it. And discussing Mafia.
All right, very good. Well, I'll see you guys Thursday or Friday.
Sergio, these here, Marcus?
Like brutal. You don't even understand.
What happened?
Do you know like how he made things?
Did you jump over?
No way. Squeezed in. Unless I jumped over, didn't even realize.
I didn't see that. Like if I were this close, I'd be like, oh wait, I can see that that's like. I mean, it's. I read it the first time. The last time it was. I didn't go back. It was getting. So what I can do is full class. So what's the?
We're going to take like the
So